Okay. So Elizabeth Urbanowicz is our speaker this evening. She is the founder of the Foundation Worldview organization. Foundation Worldview began with the realization that Christian youth exodus doesn't begin with teens, it begins with kids. And I think that's so true. Foundation Worldview is a comparative worldview curriculum for kids and teens. Several years into her teaching experience, and she taught for 10 years, Elizabeth realized that despite being raised in Christian homes, attending a Christian school, and being active in church, her students thought more like the culture than like Christ. This led her to leave her job as a teacher and to start Foundations Worldview. So the topic of Elizabeth's talk tonight is apologetics for kids. I would also just add, and I think I put that on my post for the reminder yesterday on social media, but I read a Barna study, and it sort of backs up what I just read, of Generation Z students. So it's 1999 to 2015, I think, is what's generally considered Gen Z. For those kids that were church goers, it said half of them believe that their belief in God and science were at odds, and 25% said that they thought the teaching that they received in church was shallow. And so the topic that Elizabeth is going to talk about tonight, I think, would certainly address both of those issues. Let me just quickly finish up here. Elizabeth holds a BS from Gordon College in elementary education and Spanish, an MS Ed from Northern Illinois University in literacy education, and she has an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University. And she was telling me just before we opened up that when she was teaching, and she recognized the need for what she is doing now, she really didn't know what apologetics was, and went and got her MA in apologetics from Biola. And so, how cool is that? So Elizabeth, I don't know, is there anything else that you would like for me to add before I just hand it off to you?
No, I think you did a great job. Thank you so much, Mike.
Well, it's all yours then.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming tonight. I know that this topic is a little bit different than what you probably normally cover, because especially with reasonable faith chapters, I know you're diving deep into philosophy and to science. And I hope that this isn't going to be too shallow, but just talking about actually reaching the next generation with what we're doing. In that, I'm sure that all of you are very, very intelligent, and I am not super duper intelligent, but the way that God has gifted me as being a translator, that once I can finally reach that high hanging fruit, I have the gift of being able to translate it down. And as Mike said, 7-8 years ago, if you told me that I would be dedicating my life to Christian apologetics, I would have been like, apologetics? Like, what are you talking about? But I was teaching third graders, so 9-year-olds, at a Christian school in the Chicagoland area. And I just started noticing that they were just rapidly absorbing ideas from the culture without ever questioning anything. And then when I asked, when I would ask them questions, they knew the Jesus answer, but they had no idea why, what they were being taught was true, or how it lined up with reality. And so what I started to do is I was like, okay, let me find some resources that I can use with the kids in my class and get them to start thinking well, because exactly what you're doing in this reasonable faith chapter, that's how we want to raise kids. We don't want them to believe, that the Bible is just something that they feel, or it's based on emotion, but we want them to understand that a biblical worldview is comprehensive, that encompasses all of reality. So I started looking for materials. I ordered everything I could find on the internet, which was not much. And I looked through the materials and I was like, none of this is really going to transform the way kids think. Like, there's a few good thoughts here and there, but this isn't what I'm looking for. So eventually I just started taking online classes, started attending different events with different apologetics organizations and started learning and was like, okay, let me translate this stuff down for kids. And I was just hoping they were going to start to think, when they went on social media, when they popped on YouTube, when they had conversations. And they did, they started doing that, but they also started to really critically think through science and through mathematics and through literature. And all these other teachers were coming down to my classroom and saying, like, what are you doing with these kids? Like, we've never thought this deeply, about the Christian worldview and these subjects before. So when people realized what was happening, I started getting phone calls from all over the country just saying, like, hey, how can we get our hands on your materials? And I was like, you can't, like, I'm a third grade teacher, I'm not a publishing house. And so after 3 years of receiving those requests, that's when I stepped back to go get a master's degree in Christian apologetics, because I wanted to make sure that if I was going to be leading other people, that I knew what I was talking about. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is we're just going to talk about just some things that I hope are very practical that, as you continue to be part of, reasonable, I'm sorry, did I say reason to believe? I meant to say reasonable faith. I'm sorry if I said that. RTV, I know that's on the West Coast. Reasonable faith is in Georgia. I'm very sorry.
You did say reasonable faith, Elizabeth.
Okay, good. All of a sudden I was like, oh no, did I say reasons to believe? I know this is the reasonable faith meeting. There we go.
Yeah, sorry. I did that.
No, that's fine. So what we're going to talk about tonight is just how we can practically take some of these things, like that you're discussing and the different speakers that you're having, and how can we then take that and then really equip the kids that God has placed within our sphere of influence, whether it's your own children or grandchildren, nieces, nephews, kids in the community, kids at church. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do two things. The first thing is we're going to explore just 3 distinct strategies for making apologetics accessible to kids. Like, how can we take these lofty philosophical, theological, scientific concepts, and how can we actually put legs on them so that kids can grasp them? And then just want us to just think about, okay, where in, like in your own sphere of influence, could some of these strategies come in handy? And now, usually when I start off this talk and I'm talking about apologetics for kids, I usually have to explain what apologetics is, but I know I don't have to do that here. But then after I do that, normally people are like, okay, like, we're talking about children here. We're not talking about like Einstein. Like, how in the world do we actually make this accessible to kids? So we're going to talk about 3 distinct things. And the first thing that we need to do, I'm going to give you a list really quick, but then we're going to dive in deep to each of these. The first thing that we need to do is we need to have some sort of a game plan. We need to develop a plan, because a lot of times when we're thinking about spiritual formation for our kids, or for the kids that God has placed in our life, or for our grandkids, or for the kids in our church, we kind of think of, random topics that we want to cover, things that we want them prepared with, but we don't necessarily come up with like a plan, like what's everything that they really need to know. So the first thing is to develop a plan. The second thing we're going to talk about is using concrete examples to teach abstract concepts. So that's really how we can get some of these deeper concepts down to kids, by attaching something concrete to them. So we'll talk more about that. And then the third thing is to get good at asking good questions, to actually practice how can we ask good questions. So we're going to dive deep into each of those things. Now, the first thing was to develop a plan. And this is something usually when I talk to parents or to grandparents or to pastors or just people involved within the Christian community, and I ask them how they're preparing their kids to understand the truth of the Christian worldview, how to understand that Christian faith is reasonable. They'll talk about conversations that they'll have with their kids, which is great, but conversations by itself is not enough. I always tell people to think about, mathematics. If you had children and you were going to a parent-teacher conference and you asked them, the teacher, okay, so what is going on in mathematics this year? And the teacher said, oh, we love mathematics so much. Mathematics happens in the everyday conversations as the kids are walking down the hall, as they're unpacking their backpacks, as they're eating lunch. We just talk about math all the time. And then you ask, okay, but like, what are you learning in mathematics? And the teacher just kept coming back to these conversations. You'd think, okay, there's no way the kids in this classroom are going to be able to have mathematic understanding. They're going to have huge gaps in their knowledge of mathematics if it's not directly taught. Yes, you need those everyday conversations, but you also need to directly teach it. And so that's the same way when we think about our faith, when we think about theology and philosophy, big worldview issues, we actually need to have a game plan for, okay, how are we going to do this? So that the kids in our care, they are really prepared to think well. And this is why we really want to capitalize on the younger years. And that's what the ministry that I run, Foundation Worldview, that's what we focus on, is really targeting kids that are 8 to 12 years old as their critical thinking skills are starting to develop. Because a lot of times apologetics instruction, if it's done at all, is reserved for high schoolers, which it's really valuable in high school. It's great if youth ministries or parents or Christian schools do apologetics with high schoolers. But the thing is, by the time you get to your senior year in high school, those kids have had their critical thinking skills developed for the past 8 to 10 years. So we've lost all of that time when we could be working to train them really well. So we need some sort of a game plan. Now, some people I talk to, they feel really equipped to come up with a game plan, thinking like, okay, these are the scientific concepts that kids need to understand. These are the biblical concepts kids need to understand. These are the philosophical concepts kids need to understand. And then other people are like, I don't even know where to begin. And so that's why the ministry that I run exists, because we want to help people actually know, okay, how can you actually develop this game plan? What are the really important concepts to cover with kids? So that first thing is just to have some sort of a game plan, to know how we're going to get from A, where we're starting, to Z, where we want the kids to be by the time they're no longer within the walls of a Christian home or church, when they're off on their own. The second thing that I mentioned is we want to use concrete examples to teach abstract concepts. So anytime we want to teach an abstract concept, if we can attach it to something concrete, like think about if you have children or grandchildren or just work with children anytime in your church setting, think about when they're learning how to add. Okay, a preschool teacher doesn't say, okay, what's 5 plus 3? What a preschool teacher does is she pulls out blocks, these physical blocks, and she has the kids count them. And she takes out 5 blocks and they learn how to count to 5. And then she takes out 3 blocks and they learn how to count to 3. And then she pushes them together and they count up to 8. Then once they've gotten used to working with those physical blocks, then she can move to the symbolic stage and she puts numbers down on the paper and she writes the number 5 and she writes the number 3 and they work to add it to 8. And eventually, by the time a kid is 7, 8 years old, you can just call out 5 plus 3 and they say 8. Okay, that's really an abstract concept, 5 plus 3 equals 8, that number sentence. But once they have learned it through physical counting, it's a lot easier to understand in the abstract. And so the same is true for any apologetics concept. So I'm going to give you a quick example here. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So when we're thinking about something like wanting kids to understand that the evidence that we find in the world around us does not point to just some random generation of life, that when we look at the vast quantities of information found in DNA and we see that it points to a designer. And so we want them to see that. So here's a way, rather than just talking about that, yes, like the information found in DNA points to a designer, we can actually put legs to this by attaching something concrete. So what I would do with a 7, 8-year-old is I would take, you can get Scrabble tiles or bananagrams or any kind of letters, and just take letters and you can shake them up and they'll look something like this. And then you have the kid come and you have them look and say, okay, so look at these letter tiles. Let's see these letter tiles. Do they spell anything? I see an A that says A. I see an I that says I, but I don't really see any words. Do these letter tiles, do they look like they got this way by accident, or do they look like they got this way on purpose? And then the kid says, well, they kind of look like they got this way by accident. And then I say, well, could I have taken each one of these letters and could I have arranged them like this, all scrambled up? Yeah, okay. Well, then next to that, I have another group of letters that looks like this. And we say, okay, look at these letters. Okay, these letters, they're kind of in a line. Okay, do these letters spell anything? Okay, and then life contains information. Oh, interesting. Okay, so these letters, if we took these letters and we shook them up in a cup and we dumped them out, could we get it to spell this same sentence on 3 different lines with the letters kind of evenly spaced, giving us this information? And so sometimes the kids will say, yeah, and so we'll say, okay, let's try it. And then we try it and we take the letters and we put them in a cup and we shake them up, and it usually looks something like this. And we'll say, oh, you know what, let's try again. And we'll try 5 times, we'll try 10 times, we'll try 15 times. So, well, what if we tried 1,000,000 times? Would we ever get this much information? And then no, because we know that when we find something like this, that somebody who was intelligent, someone who has some intelligence has to be there to give us this information. And that's when we then dive in to, okay, DNA, and we look at what is DNA, okay, and how is it coded? I mean, obviously we're getting, you know, a basic level of how it's coded, but then, okay, look at the vast quantities of information found in DNA. So much more than the sentence, life contains information. So when we see this, when we see so much information in DNA, what does it point to? Does it point to somebody randomly shaking up a jar and dumping out letters, or does it point to actually letters being designed and then having them talk through that? So with an example like this, the great thing about doing something like this is you're taking the abstract and you're putting something concrete to it so that kids can really see what you're talking about. But then we're also giving them the opportunity to think through it. Because I didn't just have to give them a whole lecture on, okay, let me explain to you, boys and girls, on why we know that blind, unguided evolution could not have been the way that things came about, that there needed to be a designer. I didn't need to say that to them. Okay, they were able to see through these concrete examples and then asking questions. Another example that I like to give is I like to, like when we're talking about what it means to be human. Okay, and we think that from a naturalistic perspective, humans are simply the sum of their parts. Okay, we're just physical beings. Where from the biblical perspective, yes, humans are these complex physical beings that are also intimately intertwined with something metaphysical, with a soul. And so to get kids thinking through that, here's another example where we can take something abstract like the soul, okay, or the unification of soul and body, and put some legs on it. So what I would do with kids here, is I would just show them pictures. And now hopefully a lot of you or all of you have actual physical photo albums from back in the day and from when you were growing up and, you know, different parts of your development. So this is what I would do with kids. So say, okay, I'm going to show you some pictures of myself, but you got to promise not to laugh too hard, okay? Because I'm going to look a little bit different. So I would show them a picture and I'd say, can you believe this is Miss Elizabeth when she was born? Like, oh my goodness, I had like 3 chins and no hair. Can you believe that? And, you know, they laugh and think it's really funny. And then I'd say, well, I have a question for you. Is that Elizabeth Urbanowicz in this picture? Even though I don't have 3 chins anymore and I have some hair, is that Elizabeth Urbanowicz in this picture? Yeah, and then I'd show them another picture. Oh, look, I got a little bit older and I didn't have 3 chins anymore, but still was bald. But even though I was bald, was that still Elizabeth Urbanowicz in that picture? Yeah, and we'd go through like a bunch of pictures, you know, when I was growing up, and then when I started to lose some of my teeth and got older, and then junior high, and we talked through all of the different ways, like, oh, you know, my body's changed so much throughout the years, but is it still Elizabeth Urbanowicz in all of these pictures? Yeah, it is in all of these pictures. And so then I'd say, you know, if I showed you pictures 30, 40, 50 years from now, my body would continue to change. My hair is going to go gray. I'm going to get more wrinkles on my face. I'm probably going to get shorter because my body's going to shrink a little bit. But will it still be me? When I'm 85, will it still be me? Yes. And so then the question is, okay, so if the majority of the cells in my body are different than the ones I was born with, what does that tell you about what makes me me? And then have the kids talk through that. Okay, so if most of my physical body is different, what is it that actually makes me me? And then talk about, there must be some part of me that's not physical. Like there must be some part of me that's not just flesh and bones, that's not just my skin and my blood. And then that's when we can bring in the concept of the soul. And then attach scripture to it and talk about how scripture talks about that through all of that. You know, that when God created Adam, he breathed into him and he became a living being. Okay, that Hebrew word, that nefesh, that soul. And so we're not saying, okay, like we're not just saying, okay, this is the Bible, trust it, blindly believe it. We're actually having them look at some physical evidence. We're attaching this abstract concept to something concrete and then saying, oh my goodness, look at what the evidence points to. And Oh my goodness, who knew? This is what the Bible talks about too. Can you believe it? Isn't that kind of crazy? This is what the Bible talks about. So that's the second thing that we want to do, is we really want to attach the abstract concept to something physical. Then the third thing, so the first thing was to have a game plan. Second thing was to use concrete objects to teach abstract concepts. And the third thing is to ask good questions. Now, this can be one of the most difficult ones, because especially when someone's done a lot of studying and when we're really passionate about the truth, what's easiest to do is to actually lecture, okay? To actually just give a long presentation, kind of like what I'm doing today. But for kids, that's not what is most beneficial. And for most people, asking questions really gets us to think. Think about how Jesus interacted with so many people who came to him. He didn't respond right away with an answer. He asked them a question back so that they were the ones doing the thinking, because brain research has found that in an interaction, the person who does the majority of the talking is the one who does the majority of the thinking, and therefore the majority of the learning. So as we think about asking kids good questions, we want to think about questions that elicit deep thinking. And so questions that elicit deep thinking, they really have three things in common. And again, I'm going to go through this list quickly, but then we're going to dive into each one individually. So questions that elicit deep thinking, the first thing that they have in common is they're open-ended. And so you're probably already familiar with this, but we'll talk a little bit more about it. The second thing that they have in common is they do not presuppose an answer. Okay, a question that elicits deep thinking does not presuppose an answer. And the third thing is it actually requires some form of defense. Okay, so they're open-ended, they don't presuppose an answer, and they require a defense. So I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. I'm sorry for all this back and forth. I've just learned as I've done Zoom presentations that sometimes it's hard to listen to someone when there's just a teeny tiny talking head on the screen. So the first thing that these questions have in common is they're open-ended, so meaning that they're not yes or no questions. Because any of you who've raised a teenager, okay, think about when they come home and you're like, so how was school? Fine. Did you have a good day? Yes. Do you have any homework? No. Okay, these are close-ended questions that don't require really any thinking. Where if we asked a question like, okay, tell me the two worst things about your day, okay, or tell me one highlight from your day, you can't answer it in just a yes or no question, or yes or no answer. So we're going to look at this. So an example of a closed-ended question would be, are the teachings of Christianity different than the teachings of other religions? Okay, this is a yes or no question. Yes, they're different, or no, they're not. What we can do is we can actually change the way we word a question like this so that it's not a yes or no question. So we could change it to, how are the teachings of Christianity similar to or different than other religions? So in this, the kid is actually required to think through what are some of the similarities and differences. Now you might be thinking, okay, my grandkids or my kids or the kids at church, there's no way they'd be prepared to answer this question. They don't know what other religions teach. That's why this questioning thing comes third. That first, we have to have a game plan. Second, we actually have to teach the concepts using something concrete. And then third, ask questions. And if a kid's going to be able to answer this question, obviously they have to know some of the basic teachings of Christianity, and they have to know some of the basic teachings of other religions. So we need to do those two things first. Okay, another example of the closed-ended question would be, do feelings always point us to truth? Okay, this is a big one in the culture in which we live, that so much is just emotional appeal, and everyone is seeking to conform reality to their feelings, rather than what humans have always done is striving to conform their feelings to reality. But this question, again, yes or no question. Do feelings always point us to truth? Yes? No. A way we could change this is instead we could say, how do you know whether feelings always point to truth? Okay, this requires more thinking. It requires a deeper explanation. So a lot of times, rather than starting off with the word do, we could start off with the word how, because how requires a more in-depth explanation. Okay, so that first thing is we need to make sure that these questions, that they're not closed-ended, that they're open-ended. The second thing is these questions, we need to make sure they do not presuppose an answer. Now, I would assume most of you in reasonable faith, because you have already thought so deeply about what you believe, that a lot of the questions that you ask probably do not presuppose an answer. This is something that, especially in Sunday schools and children's church times, happens a lot, that the kids are already given the answer in the question, and they know already to say God, Jesus, or the Bible. Several years ago at the church that I was attending, I was teaching a 3rd through 5th grade class, and I would teach it once a month. And one Sunday between services, I was out in like the coffee bar area just working on something. And one of the kids from the class saw me, and his reaction when he saw me, he goes, "Oh no, it's you." And I was like, "Well, it is so good to see you too this morning, Samuel. Why are you so happy to see me?" And he was like, "Because seeing you means you're probably our teacher, and I hate it when you're our teacher." And I was like, "Really? What do you hate so much about when I'm your teacher?" And he said, "Well, because whenever somebody else teaches, I just say Jesus is the answer every time, and I usually get candy and they're happy." He said, "But whenever I say Jesus and you're the teacher, you make me explain why, and I hate that." He was like, "Because that makes me think, and you're not supposed to think at church, you're supposed to think at school." And so, I mean, my response was, I laughed out loud, and I said, "Samuel, I know that was not meant as a compliment, but that's one of the biggest compliments any kid has ever given me." But it also points out really the sad reality that a lot of times kids think, I go to school, I turn on my brain, I go to church, I turn off my brain, and I say Jesus. Now, Jesus may in fact be the answer to the question that a teacher asks, but the kids need to know why. Why is he the answer to that question? So here's an example of a question that presupposes an answer. How do you know life didn't begin accidentally? Okay, you see the answer is already given. Life did not start accidentally. Okay, here is my answer, children. Now you defend it. Where what we want to do is we want to make sure we haven't given them the biblical answer in the question, because we want to make sure that we're making space for them to give a non-biblical answer. Because if they don't really believe that something is true, we want to know here and now. We don't want to find out when they're 18, when they're 21, when they're 35. We want to know now so that we have the opportunity to continue talking with them and dialoguing with them. A way that we could turn this into a question that does not presuppose an answer is we could ask, what makes you think life did or did not begin accidentally? Okay, so we can change the way that that question is worded. And I found that once I started doing this with the students in my classroom, started asking them questions that did not presuppose an answer, they felt a lot more free to actually ask questions or to actually share the answers that they really thought. One morning, a girl came in my class, and I would always greet my students at the door and give them a hug and ask them a question. And so she came in and she gave me a hug, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Urbanowicz. I finished my book report last night. And oh, those stories about Jesus in the Bible, the stories about him rising, I decided that they can't be true." And I was like, "Really?" And I know most people would probably be like, "Oh no, she's defecting from the faith," where I was so excited because I was like, yes, like she's reading these stories and she's thinking about them, and then she's letting me know what her thoughts are. And so we had many follow-up conversations about that. And it turned out that she had happened to read 2 different resurrection accounts in the same night. She was reading her Bible in 3rd grade. That was great. And she read, that in one account there was 2 angels, in another account there was 1 angel. In one account, the women, there's multiple women. In another account, it's just we see Mary. And so she was thinking critically, and it was so exciting. And by the end of the year, she was able to articulate why those small differences didn't mean that the gospels were false. But if we didn't have that kind of relationship where I was asking these questions and she felt safe to honestly answer them and to ask her own questions, she would have had that thought in 3rd grade, and it would have stayed somewhere in her mind. And who knows where it would have grown, by the time she was in 8th grade, by the time she was a senior, by the time she was 25 years old. One more example of a question that presupposes an answer would be, why does being a boy or a girl matter? Okay, big topic in our culture today. But we've already given the kids the answer. Being a boy or being a girl matters. It's very important. It's an important part of your design. So we could change the way that we word this question to, what evidence is there that being a boy or a girl does or doesn't matter? And then we really get to hear kids' thoughts, and it gives us the opportunity then to follow up when we really hear what they're thinking. Okay, so first, questions that elicit deep thinking, they're open-ended. They don't presuppose an answer. And the third thing is they require a defense, which some of the questions have already shown this. We want the questions to actually require a defense, that the kids are having to provide evidence, because think about what you're talking about, in these reasonable faith discussions all the time. You're talking about the evidence that there is in the universe that's pointing to a designer, and specifically the God of the Bible. And we want our kids to constantly be asking the question, what evidence is there? What evidence is there for this? Because we live in a culture that's so heavily driven by emotion, that's so easy for them to get sucked in with like, oh, this was a really compelling story. But what evidence is there? So we want to be asking them questions that require a defense. So here's an example of a question that doesn't require a defense. Do you believe we can trust the Bible? Okay, again, this is close-ended. Yes, I do. No, I don't. Well, we want to actually ask them, do you believe that? And then why? Why do you think we can or cannot trust the Bible? So a way that we could change this is we could change it to, what 3 reasons do you think best explain why we can or cannot trust the Bible? Okay, again, this is why questioning comes in third. We have to have some sort of a game plan and have some sort of teaching before we're asking this question. If you just go and ask an 8-year-old on the street this question, they're going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if we've already done some instruction ahead of time, then they can think through that and they can share with us whether or not they think we can trust the Bible. This is another thing I learned the hard way. When I was teaching, I was going to speak at the 3rd through 5th grade chapel at our school, and I was going to speak on the reliability of Scripture. But first, I wanted to know whether or not any kids had ever wondered, if they could trust the Bible or not. So I gave out a 3-question survey to all the 3rd through 5th graders. It was about 180 students at the time. Just asked them what grade they were in, had they ever wondered whether or not they could trust the Bible, and if they answered yes, what questions did they have? Now, I only counted a yes answer if they had a legitimate question, like if they had proven that they really thought through this before. And I was shocked because I was thinking none of my 3rd graders have ever thought about this. Maybe a few 4th graders, maybe a handful of 5th graders. 79% of the kids said yes, they had wondered whether or not they could trust the Bible, and they had legitimate questions. Like, how do we know that the Bible we have today is the Bible that was written back then? What if the people writing the Bible just wanted to trick us? Like, what if they wanted to be in charge? Well, the Muslims have a book. How do we know that our book is true and not theirs? They had legitimate questions. So we want to be preparing kids to understand these reasons for the hope that we have, and then be really asking them critically what they're thinking about it. One more example of a question that would not require defense is, do right and wrong change over time? Okay, this is a yes or a no question. But we could change this to explain 3 pieces of evidence that show right and wrong do or do not change over time, that we're actually wanting them to gather the evidence. Okay, thank you for sticking with me through all this. I know we went through a lot of different questions there. So I told you at the beginning of this chat that the goal really was to explain 3 strategies for making apologetics accessible to kids. And so that's where we talked about first, making sure we have a game plan. Second, using concrete objects to teach abstract concepts. And then third, asking good questions. That when we have these 3 things in place, we can set kids on the trajectory of learning to think well and learning to think critically through the truth of the Christian worldview. And so if you have any kids in your life or grandkids or kids just at church, and you're interested just in finding more about how to actually develop a plan and some ideas for taking these concrete objects and using them to attach them to abstract concepts, if you'd like to check out my website, it's foundationworldview.com. And we have lots of different resources on there. We sell curriculum that parents and teachers and church leaders can take kids through. And we also just have blog posts and other resources that just really are seeking to help the body of Christ get the kids in our care to really think critically through the Christian worldview, so that they understand that faith is not this blind, irrational leap into the dark. What it is, it's putting our trust in the God who we cannot see, because everything that we can see and everything that we can examine actually points to him. So I know I've talked at you for a long time now. So I'll turn it back over to Mike. And if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to ask them, or Mike, you can tell us what you normally do during this time.
Elizabeth, that was so good. Thank you. As you were talking, I was thinking about I should have had this conversation with you 9 months ago, because I just started volunteering with the middle school kids in our church, and all of the things that you've talked about, I've learned on the fly. And you're talking about younger children well, not necessarily younger children, but these are middle school kids, and I'm doing exactly the same things.
Well, that's great that you have that insight already into that, just 9 months into ministry. That's awesome.
Yeah, but I could have saved 9 months if I'd talked to you. No, it is really good. I would encourage all of you to take a look at Elizabeth's organization's website, Foundations Worldview, Elizabeth, or
Just Foundation, no
Foundation,
S.
yep,
Foundation
foundationworldview.com. She has got, in fact, you can see samples of curriculum that they provide. Elizabeth has a couple of other people that help her write the curricula, and what I had a chance to look through one of them, and they are really well done. And someone does not have to be an apologetics expert, because they do all the work for you, and it's really it's really good. So let me stop talking and open up the floor for any questions.
No, thanks, Elizabeth. I'll say something because I'm unmuted and the other two aren't. I guess I'm just guessing this, but I know Mike, he's influencing the kids at church, and Mike's got grandkids, and I do as well. And I'm assuming Mimi, I know that's not Mimi, but Pat have grandkids as well. And so, I mean, yeah, our sphere of influence are our grandkids. They're going to be looking to us, and hopefully they'll be understanding, or ask us questions, the ones that your kids have asked you. So thanks, you did a great job explaining that. Did you say you went to Northern Illinois University?
For my master's, yes.
Oh, okay. So Pat Kamens and you guys can, NIU, come on, Pat.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I don't know about
what is your name? It says Karen right now underneath your picture.
Oh, my name is Bob.
Bob.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, to meet you too. But yeah, Pat's an NIU guy. But you had a lot of, you sounded a lot like Frank Turek and J. Warren Wallace and Greg Kokel, those people. I'm guessing you know those names, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so you took a lot of good from all of them and put it together and packaged it to what you're teaching, as I think they're really good. They're asking good questions is just really so important, I think, just to let the kids think versus us telling them what to think. And I think, although your student that said that to you is better off for having to think versus you telling them what to think, because the next time, or the first time that someone tells them what to think when they're in high school or college or whenever that happens, well, they never had to think for themselves. So now you're making them think for themselves. So that's a great thing that you teach them. Any other examples that you can think of? Are they on the website that have like the using concrete objects to teach abstract concepts? I mean, do you other than
we have a bunch of them in different like blog posts. One that's been really important just in the current cultural context that we're in, where truth is just viewed as whatever I feel. Really teaching kids the difference between something that's objective, like an objective reality, an objective truth, versus a subjective changing feeling. So like one thing that we do with that, we have a bunch of different activities that we do, but one thing that usually families like, is we have directions on our website you can get that are just for like a treasure hunt with little kids. And we'll give them different directions written by different people. And we'll say, okay, some of these are going to be true directions. Some of them are going to line up with what's real, and some of them are not. And we're going to have to find out which ones are. And we send the kids off, like, and everybody goes looking for chocolate or whatever it is. And then really only one person or one group of kids finds it. And then we come back and we kind of debrief, and we're like, okay, why didn't everybody find this? And it was like, oh, well, these directions that you had, let's read them. Oh my goodness, they did not line up with what is real at all. They didn't show you the truth. So, you might have felt like these were the real directions, and the person that wrote them might have felt like they were the real directions, but if they didn't line up with what is real, were they true? No. And so just in any example that can get their bodies moving and get them excited about something, but then to hit home like, oh, so if something doesn't line up with what's real, it's not true. So that's another easy example. And we have it available on the website. Like, you can print out the directions and everything for just a little treasure hunt. But yeah, anytime we can take those, something concrete, the kids, it's really amazing how much kids can understand.
The last thing I'll say, and I'll let the other ones talk, is that that Scrabble pieces, again, that's Frank Turek, and that, I think he uses the example, if you've heard of the alphabet cereal, and open up the box, pour it on the table, and it says, take out the garbage, Mom. Do you think that just, do you think that's going to happen? How many times do you think that's going to come out when you just dump the letters from your, alphabet soup or alphabet cereal on the table? So there has to be an intelligent being that, the mom that put this out, that take out the garbage. So, and it's very similar, but it's an example that, you got to think about it, that it just doesn't happen. There's an intelligent being. So thanks for that example. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's really amazing. I just love what kids are capable of understanding once we, start to train them to think well.
The other thing I mentioned, I'm sorry, I was going to say this too, is that Mike Parks said something to us when we were working with high school kids years ago, is that the church we were at before really felt the curriculum that they were teaching the kids was just so beneath them, let's just say, thinking that the kids just aren't going to understand something. Like, you're talking the middle school kids, 3rd and 4th, 5th graders. We're talking about apologetics. I mean, we're talking at their old church here, way older than that. And the point was that, and we had that feeling years ago when we were talking, is that actually Mike was saying, man, those kids really can take a whole lot more than we're giving them, other than just, the curriculum that the church was showing. So amen to that. I think that, the kids, they want to know, if they're reading the Bible at age 3, in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and they're trying to determine if the Bible is true or not. They're ready for a whole lot more than we think that they're ready for. That's for sure.
Yes. I got into, sometimes on social media, it's a little easier to be more forceful than you would be in person. And I didn't realize this was going to be such an offensive thing, but I was just like, we created a meme one time that just said, if schools have 8-year-olds writing 5-paragraph essays, we should probably do something a little more intellectually stimulating than gluing cotton balls on sheep in Sunday school. And I think I offended like every Sunday school teacher from here to the Pacific Ocean. And I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize people were so attached to cotton balls. It's okay to use them, but like, let's have kids think. But it's so true that a lot of we really shortchange kids a lot of times.
And, Elizabeth, I think that's almost universally true, as in terms of just aiming too low. If we're fortunate, we get the kids an hour a week in church, and if we're not doing something that is somewhat challenging to them on an intellectual level, that's the reason for the 25% of the church-going kids to say it's too shallow.
Mm-hmm.
We're just missing the little bit of the opportunity that we have there if we do the cotton balls instead of the 5 paragraphs.
Yeah, and you mentioned before the talk just about some Barna research, and so this is older research actually from 10 years ago. But when they wrote the book "You Lost Me," one of the 6 main reasons that they found that millennials gave for leaving the church was that they found that it was just shallow. That like the teaching didn't have any substance to it. So you're right on there. Yeah.
That's interesting. This is Dave on Mimi's phone, iPad. It's actually not my iPad, it's my wife's. But anyway, yeah, right now I'm teaching a class in jail to children like 30 to 50-year-olds. And what's interesting is we kind of use the same approach like you're talking about. We ask yes and no questions for these people. And we don't really allow them to think on their own and kind of come up with their own conclusion. So I'm wondering, how do you do that with adults? Because I see a lot of similarities. In fact, the class that we're teaching is kind of taught the same way. It's like, okay, did Jesus exist? Yes. And not like, give these people a lot of time to think about coming up with their own answers. And in a way, we kind of disengage them, I think, the same way by not allowing them to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, that's a great observation. So just not knowing, too much about the context or, the people that you're teaching or what the setting is like. I mean, a couple things to think through is, actually giving them that time to think. So just intentionally changing the way some of the questions are worded ahead of time, rather than, did Jesus exist? Like, why do you think Jesus existed? And so just depending on the audience, I don't know, if in prison, how many of them, can write well, but, like if they can write, just one strategy that educational researchers have found that's beneficial in any age, that it sounds so preschool, so please forgive me, but just like hear me out. It's called think, pair, share, and just found that usually the way that the brain works best in actually thinking through information is if it has time on its own to think through it. So what you can do a lot of times is just have somebody think through their thoughts, like give them a minute to think or to write it down or just to like doodle what they're thinking, and then turn to somebody else and share it so that then they can hear somebody else's perspective and kind of match it to their own and think like, maybe I've never thought about that before, or what do I think about that? But it gives them an opportunity to verbalize their own thoughts and to hear somebody else's, to kind of like hash out ideas. And it's before they're going to actually share. I mean, if they're going to share it with a group, it kind of usually creates a little bit more confidence in that when they've had time to actually verbalize something ahead of time, had time to think through it with somebody else. And so then, ask people, like, what are your thoughts? What did you think through this question, to then have a discussion. So that can be a really good strategy. Another one, just again, I don't know, exactly what the teaching situation is like, but a lot of times what's suggested with like either like teenagers or adults, who might either not want to think through something or might, there's a little more peer pressure. When you're 8 years old, like 8-year-olds don't care what comes out of their mouth. They don't care who thinks, but, like once you reach the age of 12, we as adults and teens and, youth are like worried like, oh, like, is what I'm going to say okay? So a lot of times if you just have like index cards or sticky notes and give people the opportunity to like write down their thoughts or write down any questions, and then you collect them and it's anonymous, you can then the next week go back and address some of those or give them an opportunity to think through them. And so it's just kind of like a safe way to be like, what, okay, I know the answer is yes, Jesus existed, but I actually don't think he did. I think, this is just, a myth. So those are just some thoughts of things that you could do there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's very helpful because it helps people kind of open up as well. Yeah. And in the jail setting, a lot of these people have been in jail, 5-10 times, and for some of them many years, and it's very hard for them to open up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, things that can get them thinking and talking is really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I'll mention one thing that Mike and I did with the high school kids, and this is for you then. I'm sorry, as you said, it is not Dave. What was your first name?
Yeah, Dave is good. Better than Mimi.
I like Mimi though.
You can tell Dave, you know who's in the house because we're our wife's like that.
Dave doesn't look so much like Mimi, and Bob doesn't look so much like Karen.
Yeah. But what we did with these high school kids, actually they're just the first year coming back from college. We asked them to write down a question on a piece of paper and hand it in so no one knew what their question was. On one of a doubt that they had about Christianity. And so when we pulled the question out to talk about it, it wasn't the one guy that asked the question that he just didn't want everyone to know, like, is Jesus really real, or tell me about whatever the question was. He wasn't put on the spot. So maybe that would help your prisoners as well, that if you wanted to talk, and maybe not the beginning part of this, but maybe as you're evolving, maybe that's a way to just have them write down questions anonymously. You'll collect them and then read them off so that you can discuss it as a group, as a thought.
Yeah, interesting idea. Yeah.
Great idea.
What else? I'll relate just an experience that I had early on with eighth graders in what our church calls a compass. It's sort of like a confirmation class. But so my first couple of nights with this group, I kind of just tried to follow the script in terms of, and I was a small group leader, so I was the boys' small group leader, and try to follow the script in terms of the prepared questions, and it was okay. But I might give the discussions a C, maybe at best. And actually, I give my wife credit for the suggestion, and I had seen this done in Sunday school before. But two things. One is, along with what Elizabeth was saying, I started asking them hard questions. I stopped following the script and started asking questions that I was pretty sure it was going to be challenging for them, and maybe they don't know the answer to them. And this is probably not fair too, but I also brought a bag of Tootsie Rolls, and and whenever there was a good answer or an answer in the right direction, I'd toss them a Tootsie Roll. It was amazing the engagement that those eighth grade boys had when we started doing that. It was like every one of them wanted, they're raising their hands, and they wanted, I don't know if it was the Tootsie Rolls or probably the Tootsie Rolls, but it made it a lot of fun.
That's great.
Anyone else?
Elizabeth, got a question. I was looking at your website, and you have different curriculum, and one is for the family, for individual. But then you have, within that, you have two age groups. You do 8 and 12, which is comparative worldview curriculum, and 9 to 13, careful thinking curriculum. Where do you start? What do you suggest? And what's the difference? I mean, the age group seems to be about the same. And how does this work? Because it gives you 1 year license, which this may take longer than a year to get through.
Yeah, great question. So we put a wide age range on our materials just because we know everybody's going to be starting someplace different, with different kids. And so the first one, the comparative worldview one, is the basics, and then the careful thinking one is like a step up. And so we don't recommend starting that until they're 9, just because of the reading level required. So our comparative worldview curriculum, what it is it's basically just an introduction for kids that people think and believe differently. That not everybody has the same worldview. And so what we do with that is we have 5 units, and we look at 5 big questions. So we look at the question, what is truth? What should I worship? How did life begin? What does it mean to be human? And how can I tell right from wrong? And what we do is we introduce those big questions, and we just have the kids explore, like, what is this question? Like, when we talk about truth, what are we talking about? Or when we talk about life, or when we talk about a human, like, what are we actually talking about? We have them just explore the topic and the world around them. Then we introduce them to the biblical worldview perspective of that. So rather than just like an isolated verse here or there, we kind of have them look at the whole of scripture and like, how does the whole of scripture speak to this topic? And then we introduce them to the beliefs of 4 competing worldviews. And we look at what these 4 competing worldviews. So we look at like naturalism, or any worldview that believes only the physical realm is real. Then we look at like New Age, or this like spiritual but not religious, everything is spiritual. We look at postmodernism, the idea that we really can't know truth. We just look to our community. And then we look at Islam as another theistic religion, but that's very different than Christianity. We have them explore what do these different worldviews teach, and then we have them compare and contrast the beliefs and look at, okay, what actually lines up with reality, so that they're the ones coming to the conclusion, oh my goodness, the Christian worldview consistently lines up with what is true. And we also have really, again, we have a lot of physical activities, and we also have them watch a lot of different clips from popular kids TV shows or movies, and we have them identify, okay, what's the worldview question asked here and answered, and then what perspective is this coming from? So it's just a basic introduction to like worldview and the idea that not everybody thinks the same. And when we look at scripture, it actually consistently lines up with what we find in reality. And then the second curriculum, the careful thinking one, that is more, that's a step up. So we take, we take the worldview foundation, and then we look at the basics of logic and critical thinking and logical fallacies and actually investigating ideas. So they're taking it a notch up, and they're looking at worldview claims, and we're systematically teaching them how to evaluate ideas, again, through like fun and games and different activities. And then we have them practice. We have them look at big worldview claims. We'll have them look at the claim that, like humans can't know truth, and we have them evaluate it and look at, the evidence for or against that. Or we have them look at the claim Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And then we have them look at, okay, so like what evidence would there be that Christians and Muslims are worshiping the same God or that they aren't? So it's a step up from that. And then the second question you asked about is a year-long license and how that works. So we've specifically designed these materials with a few things in mind. The first thing is for kids, we've just made them developmentally appropriate. They align with sound brain research. So we make sure that what we're doing is actually transforming the way that they think. We also have videos for everything, so that the adult in charge needs to facilitate, but doesn't need to actually do the teaching, because we know that, you gentlemen would probably all be, confident in teaching an apologetics type class, but most Christians would not. So we have videos. And then the third thing is we didn't want it to be too overwhelming. We didn't want to give people more than they could chew, because I think we've all probably experienced being really excited about something and starting it, and then we dive in and we're like, this is too much, I can't do this. So we've specifically designed it so that each curriculum can be done when you implement it once a week, and you have even several weeks off. So each curriculum is, the first one takes 28 weeks to finish, and the second one takes 30 weeks to finish. So that gives you enough time so that you can implement it once a week. If you start to fall behind, there's 52 weeks in a year, so you have some time for time off. And then we do have year-long licenses. The reason for that, the reason is it's not just like a one and done deal, is we're constantly updating our content, and making sure that it's still relevant, that we have all the latest research involved. So we're updating the things. And so we want to make sure that people, rather than just buying something and being like, oh, and now you can buy our new version, we update it all the time. And when renewals are for a discounted rate. So it's like you pay the initial licensing fee, and then you can renew for a discounted rate. So did that answer your question, Pat?
Yes, it did. But those topics seem like even guys in my Bible study could use them.
Yes, I actually,
this is for third
it was
grade.
funny. I was, so the Careful Thinking curriculum just launched last week. That's our newest product. And then we have a preschool series, so for little guys, that's coming out next month. But I was Zooming with Mike Lycona. I don't know if you're familiar with
Sure.
his work, but I was Zooming with him and his wife last week just to take them through the curriculum. And Mike kept saying, I just can't see myself having been ready for this at 9 years old. I just can't see myself having been ready. I'm like, I know. I was like, but kids are faced with so much more nowadays, so they're thinking through so many more things because the vast quantity of information. I was like, and again, we take these these abstract concepts and we attach them to something concrete, to make sure that it's not just like, okay, kids, and the second law of logic is, we're actually attaching them to something concrete. So good thoughts.
Those are awesome. I'm telling you, for kids, if they grab half of what you're talking about at that young age, you're just giving them a foundation so that when they get older, they've got something to fall back on. And I give you so much credit. I mean, that's such good stuff. I mean, I was thinking the same thing, Pat. I was thinking, actually, I know you guys don't know this, but Pat's got a Bible study. He does it as a work on a Friday. And I don't know if this would work for adults, but again, that's something, that I don't know if you had that in your mind, Pat, but
Well,
but
yeah,
it-
when you think about these topics, you're going, and you know, adults can relate to younger children's method. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, you can watch cartoons and actually still learn, as long as the information is true and factual.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to do videos, is because we wanted the adults to learn, you know, because you gentlemen know this stuff, but most, you know, Christian adults don't. And so we wanted them to be able to learn alongside the kids. Because when I mean, science is not my area of expertise. I've grown in this, but I've never been a science buff. In my first year teaching fourth grade, I was required to teach science to all 3 classes. And I was like, the first day of class, this kid raises his hand. He's like, will we be covering string theory this year? And I was like, no, because I don't even know what that is. But all year long, I was like, okay, I got to learn this stuff. So I would go to the kids section of the library and I would pull like all the kids books on a topic down. And I learned so much through that because it was at a level, you know, that me, the not science buff, could understand. So that's one of our goals, is we want to teach it at a child's level so that adults can learn alongside the kids as well.
I
Well,
just
my
think,
children are preschool, so I think I would, when I looked at this, I'm like, yeah, mine aren't 8. My youngest grandchild's 16, but the group after that is, I think the oldest is 5. So the preschool one would be perfect for that lower group.
Yeah. If you go to our website, if you want to sign up for updates, you can do that, and we just send out like an email when our new materials come out. Because we don't recommend with our current materials, we don't recommend going younger than 8 years old, just because cognitively, where kids are developmentally, they really need to be at 8 to be able to consider perspectives outside of their own. And then also just the reading level. There's a good amount of reading involved. And so they really need to be at least at a 3rd grade reading level. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
anyone else? Elizabeth, I just think what you're doing is so good. It's a gold mine. You know, you think about what young kids think about, the culture they're in now. You said you were talking with Michael O'Conan. He was talking about he couldn't grasp that when he was 9 years old, and I think all of us in this group, outside of yourself, are older than Michael O'Conan, and you just think about what has changed and what they're faced with now. And to be able to start that at the age that you have designed this curriculum to start at, I think is just fabulous. So my hat's off to you. If there is anything that I can do to support the work that you're doing, to promote the work that you're doing, you know, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, because I definitely think you're on to something, and it's really good.
Well, thank you.
So we will wrap up with that. Elizabeth, you are always welcome to come back to a Reasonable Faith Chicago meeting. Thank you again for joining us. I've been looking forward to your talk ever since you and I had set on this date. So thank you for doing that. Guys, thanks for being here as well. And everyone have a good evening.
all right. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Bye.
Elizabeth. Bye-bye.